New York. The cold wind slammed against the windows of the taxi parked by the roadside. Rain lashed against the glass, leaving murky streams. Behind the wheel sat Ray Cooper, a man in his 60s, with a weathered face and tired eyes. His gray hair peeked out from under a dark baseball cap, and his calloused hands gripped the steering wheel. He had been driving a taxi for 30 years, seeing it all, from drunken office parties to bloodied passengers after late-night fights. But tonight he felt different, as if something ominous hung in the air. Ray glanced at his phone, a new ride request. The address was in the heart of Manhattan, near the Plaza Hotel. He raised his collar and sighed deeply. "Okay, let's go," he muttered and pressed the gas. Raindrops slid down the windshield, flashing lights from billboards and traffic signals flickered. Ray pulled up to the hotel, and as soon as the window rolled down, he saw a man in a black coat and red tie. His face was impassive, his posture confident. Ray recognized him immediately. Donald Trump. Ray tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Anger bubbled up in his chest. "No," he muttered under his breath. "I'm not taking him." Trump opened the door and leaned toward the window. "To the conference center on 7th Avenue, please." Ray noticed a small silver cross on the lapel of Trump's coat. His eyes narrowed. "Sorry, I can't take this ride," Ray said, looking away. Trump raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean you can't? Your car is free." Ray cleared his throat, a sharp edge creeping into his voice. "I don't take people with crosses." "Is this a joke?" Trump's voice turned cold. "You have a license, don't you?" Ray stayed silent. "This is discrimination," Trump said, giving him a look that would have made most people uneasy. "Call it whatever you want," Ray replied, gesturing with his hand toward the exit. "I'm not driving you." Trump paused for a moment, then slowly got out of the taxi and sighed deeply. "Fine." He took out his phone and started dialing. Ray watched him through the rearview mirror. His chest felt heavy, but at the same time, calm. But just seconds later, a man in a dark suit, a bodyguard, ran up to the taxi. "Roll down the window," he ordered. Ray sighed and pressed the button. "What's going on?" the bodyguard asked. "You heard me. I refuse to drive him," Ray answered, not hiding the anger in his voice. The bodyguard held his gaze for a second, then stepped back a pace and whispered something into the microphone in his ear. Ray thought that would be the end of it. But a minute later, 2 police officers in dark blue uniforms approached. "Are you Ray Cooper?" one of them, a thin sergeant with a receding hairline, asked. "Yes," Ray answered calmly. "Please step out of the car." Ray opened the door and stepped out into the rain. He stood, eyes fixed on Trump, who calmly watched the scene with his arms crossed. "You refused service due to religious symbols?" the sergeant asked. "Exactly," Ray said, not blinking. The sergeant looked at his partner, then shifted his gaze to Trump, who barely smiled. "This is a violation of the law, Mr. Cooper," the sergeant said, pulling out a notebook. "I'll have to file a report." "Take it to court," Ray threw back. "I'm not changing my mind." The officer looked at him for a few more seconds, then began filling out the report. Ray stood in the cold rain, feeling the droplets slip down his collar. He glanced at Trump. "You better call another taxi," Ray said coldly. "I will," Trump replied, "but we'll meet again." Ray didn't respond. He got back in the car, started the engine, and drove off sharply. In the rearview mirror, he saw Trump standing in the rain, with the bodyguard holding an umbrella over him. Ray gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He knew this story was just beginning. Trump looked at the driver. His face remained calm, but there was a sharp gleam in his eyes. "Listen," Trump said in a steady but firm voice. "I asked if you could take me. I didn't ask for your judgment or your religious views." The driver, George, clenched his hands on the steering wheel, his face turning red. "I have the right to refuse if the passenger bothers me," he replied, avoiding Trump's gaze. "Bothers me." Trump leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering, but becoming even more menacing. "How exactly am I bothering you?" George nervously swallowed and glanced at the cross on Trump's chest. "This symbol. It means hatred," George muttered. "I don't want to deal with those who wear it." Trump pressed his lips into a thin line. He knew what George was feeling. He understood how deep the division in society was, how poisonous the rhetoric had become. But now he felt a sharp irritation at how quickly he was being judged by his appearance. "And what exactly do you know about me?" Trump raised an eyebrow. "Besides the fact that I wear this cross." George sighed. "Everyone knows this symbol is associated with." He hesitated. "Extremists. I don't want anyone who might support that in my car." Trump ran his hand over the cross and paused for a moment. "You know, I wore this cross because of my grandfather," he said softly. "He wore it his whole life. He wasn't an extremist. He was just a man who believed in goodness." George didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the road, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm not who you think I am," Trump continued. "But if it's easier for you to judge me by symbols rather than actions, that's your choice. I can leave and find another taxi. But know this is how division begins. Not because of ideas, but because of the unwillingness to listen to each other." George sighed heavily. Conflicting thoughts raced through his mind. He had heard the news, seen protests, read articles, and everywhere this symbol was associated with hatred. But now, sitting in front of him was a man who didn't seem malicious or aggressive. His heart pounded. "Are you sure you don't support all of that?" he asked quietly. "Sure," Trump said. His voice remained calm, but his gaze was firm. "Otherwise, I wouldn't be trying to talk to you now." George remained silent for a long moment, staring at the road. Then he sighed deeply and leaned back in his seat. "Okay," he said. "Get in." Trump walked around the car, sat in the back seat, and closed the door. George started the engine and drove off. An oppressive silence hung in the car. Trump stared out the window, his face remaining impassive. George instinctively reached for the radio to fill the emptiness, but something held him back. "Press conference on Fifth Avenue, right?" George finally asked. "Yes," Trump answered briefly. "Important meeting?" Trump turned his head and looked at the driver in the rearview mirror. "Very important." George nodded slightly and pursed his lips. "Why did you react so calmly to my refusal?" he asked unexpectedly. Trump smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth. "Because I know what real hatred looks like. And this isn't it." George slammed on the brakes. A red light had turned on ahead. His hands tightened around the steering wheel again. "Then what was that?" he asked. Trump answered without hesitation. "Fear." The light turned green. George stepped on the gas, and the car smoothly moved forward. "What am I supposed to be afraid of?" George said quietly. Trump looked at him through the rearview mirror. "Dialogue," he said. "People find it easier to refuse to communicate than to risk hearing something uncomfortable." George pondered these words while the car moved down the boulevard, passing by tall buildings, some adorned with American flags. "I thought I knew what truth looked like," George finally said. "But I guess I was wrong." Trump looked away and once again stared out the window. "You weren't wrong," he said. "You just weren't looking in the right place." They were approaching Fifth Avenue when George stopped the car by the red carpet where reporters were already gathering. "Are you sure you want to go in there?" George asked. Trump smiled. "Yes. I'm used to people judging me without knowing who I really am." George briefly fixed his gaze on him. "And how do you handle that?" Trump opened the door and stepped out of the car. Before closing it, he leaned in and said, "I listen before making conclusions. Maybe you should try that too." George watched as Trump walked into the crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed in his face, microphones stretched toward him, but he remained calm, confident, and unflinching. George watched him for a few more seconds, then turned his gaze to the cross that still lay on the seat beside him. He sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Maybe I really wasn't looking in the right place," he muttered, and, starting the engine, slowly drove away. George was driving through Manhattan, but his mind stayed at the same spot where he had dropped Trump off. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The last words Trump had said echoed in his head. "I listen before making a judgment. Maybe you should try it too." He nervously ran his hand through his hair, his heart pounding. What was that all about? He muttered to himself. He tried to forget the moment, but something in Trump's behavior didn't fit into his usual worldview. George was used to having all kinds of people in his car, aggressive, arrogant, nervous, but Trump was different. Calm, confident, and straightforward. George stopped at a traffic light. A group of protesters stood on the sidewalk nearby. They were holding signs with familiar slogans, symbol of hate, ban it, we stand against discrimination, stop the propaganda. His heart tightened. George felt a surge of anger. He remembered how hard it had been for his sister when she was fired because of her background. How his best friend Bill ended up on the street after refusing to follow an order that went against his beliefs. All of this had started with people like Trump. Right? The light turned green. George drove on, but the internal struggle continued. Why did he take it so easily? George thought. Why didn't he argue? Why didn't he try to justify himself or convince me? He turned onto 10th Avenue when his app chimed again. A new ride. George accepted it almost automatically. He pulled up to the curb and saw a middle-aged woman in a black coat. She stood, clutching her phone in her hand. George rolled down the window. Good afternoon. Are you the one who ordered the taxi? The woman looked up. A silver cross hung around her neck. George felt a wave of anxiety rise in his chest. Are you getting in or not? The woman asked sharply. George hesitated. He wanted to refuse. He had already opened his mouth to cancel the ride, but remembered Trump's look in the rearview mirror. His calmness. His words. Try listening. George pressed his lips together. Get in, he said briefly. The woman sat in the back seat, and George drove off. Where are we going? To the hospital on 33rd, she replied, not looking up from her phone. An uncomfortable silence filled the car. Do you often go there? George asked, trying to break the tension. Recently, yes, the woman said. George noticed out of the corner of his eye how she nervously gripped the phone. If you don't mind me asking, why? He asked carefully. The woman took a deep breath. My son has cancer. Stage 3. He's only 10. Her voice trembled. George felt something tighten in his chest. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Don't worry, she sighed. Nowadays, everyone judges each other over little things. But when you're standing by your child's hospital bed, all these arguments seem so meaningless. George glanced at her in the rearview mirror. People are afraid of what they don't understand, he said, repeating Trump's words. The woman looked up, and their eyes met in the reflection of the mirror. That's true, she said quietly. They arrived at the hospital. George stopped near the entrance. The woman opened the door, but before stepping out, she paused for a second. Thank you for the ride, she said. And for the conversation. George wanted to respond, but she had already closed the door. He watched as she hurried toward the hospital entrance. Trump's voice echoed in his mind again. I listen before making a judgment. George ran his hand over his face and sighed. He was about to drive off when he saw the silver cross on the seat next to him. The woman must have accidentally left it behind. He picked it up, feeling the cool metal in his hand. George looked at the hospital. For a moment, he thought about just driving away. But then he remembered Trump's look and the woman's words about her son. He opened the door and quickly walked toward the hospital entrance. Excuse me, he called out, spotting the woman at the registration desk. She turned around, and George handed her the cross. "You left this in the car," he said. The woman took the cross and smiled gratefully. "Thank you. It was a gift from my husband. He wore it until her voice faltered. "It's very important to me. I'm glad I could return it," George said. The woman smiled, squeezed the cross in her hand, and said, "You're not what I expected you to be." George paused for a moment, then smiled slightly. "And neither are you," he replied. He turned back to the car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared thoughtfully at the road. "I listen before making a judgment." George smiled and pressed the gas pedal. George returned to the driver's seat and drove off, but thoughts about the cross and Trump's words wouldn't leave him. He felt something shifting inside him. Something was breaking and at the same time coming together into a new picture. He stopped at a red light when his phone beeped again. A new request. George accepted it without even looking at the address. He pulled up to the curb and saw a man in an expensive suit. He was standing, leaning on a black case, nervously glancing at his phone. When George stopped, the man decisively got into the back seat. "Wall Street," he said briefly. "Okay," George replied, driving off. A minute passed in silence. George noticed in the mirror that the man opened his case and took out some documents. He was signing something, frowning in concentration. "Tough day?" George asked, trying to break the tension. The man raised his head, his eyes narrowing. "Tough year," he replied shortly, then lowered his gaze back to the documents. George stayed silent, but then the man spoke again. "Losses. Constant ones. The company is on the brink of bankruptcy." George raised an eyebrow in surprise. In his mind, people in expensive suits were always at the top of their game. "Is it because of the economy?" he asked carefully. The man gave a short smile, cold and tense. "It's because of people. They're panicking. They don't want to take risks, and now I'm trying to hold together what's already falling apart." George thought he heard both anger and despair in the man's voice. "So what are you going to do?" he asked. "I'll find an investor, or I'll sink with the company." George thought about Trump, about how calmly he had taken his anger. "Maybe you should try listening," George said unexpectedly. The man looked at him in the mirror, surprised. "What did you say?" "Listen to people," George explained. "Not just investors or partners. Regular people. They often know more than it seems." The man squinted, thinking over George's words. "You talk like you figured something out." George smiled faintly. "Let's just say, I got advice from someone I didn't expect to hear from." The man paused for a moment, then put the documents back in his case and took a deep breath. "I'll think about it," he said. They arrived at the office on Wall Street. The man opened the door, but before he got out, he said, "I don't know why I told you all that." "Maybe because sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger," George replied. The man nodded and closed the door. George watched him walk into the building with marble columns. The phone beeped again. Another request. George accepted it, feeling something change inside him. He was beginning to see people differently. Not as cliches or labels, but as people with their own stories, fears, and hopes. He pulled up to the pickup spot and saw a young woman with a small child in her arms. The woman looked tired, but when she saw George, she tried to smile. "Hello," George said, opening the door. "Hi," the woman replied, sitting in the back seat. "Can you fasten the car seat?" "Of course," George answered, standing up to help her. When he had set the seat, the woman said, "Thank you. This is the third try." The last two drivers refused. "Why?" George asked, sitting behind the wheel. "Because it's extra hassle," the woman said with a bitter smile. "People rarely want to help." George glanced at her in the mirror. The woman was young, no older than 20. The child was peacefully sleeping in the seat. "People change," George said. "I wish I could believe that," the woman said, looking out the window. George paused for a moment. "If you want to see change, sometimes you have to start with yourself," he said. The woman looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Are you a driver or a psychologist?" George laughed. "Just a driver who started listening." They reached the destination. The woman got out of the car, holding the child in her arms. "Thanks for the help," she said. "Always happy to help," George replied. She closed the door, and George was once again alone. He looked at the road ahead. The traffic light turned green. George smiled and pressed the gas. "I listen before making conclusions." He was beginning to understand that Trump was right. The world wasn't black and white. People were complicated. Sometimes, all it took was simply listening to them to understand more than it seemed. George was driving through the city at night, and the more he thought, the more he realized how difficult all of this was. People, their fears, ambitions, desires, failures, it all swirled in his head like a kaleidoscope. Among all these unknown faces, he began to feel not only cold distance, but also some strange connection. This was no longer just a job. The phone rang again, a call that promised nothing good. He looked at the screen. It was a familiar number. The same one that had once called to offer easy money for participating in small schemes. George didn't hesitate. He pressed the reject button. Instead of driving back into the night city, he decided to head in another direction, to the park. Sometimes you just need to stop and give yourself time to think. He left the car in the parking lot while the night silence enveloped him. He stepped onto the path, breathed in the cool air that seemed particularly fresh amidst all the hustle. It felt as though all these people, their problems, their ambitions, they were somewhere far away. George walked up to a bench, sat down, and simply began watching the stars. They seemed so distant, yet so constant, in contrast to what he felt here on Earth, among people. It took a moment, but he understood. These actions, these spontaneous refusals of bad calls, these small steps away from promises and manipulations, that was where the true power lay. In not giving in not letting other voices determine your path. With calm, he returned to the car, started it, and drove home. Tonight, he didn't want to listen to anyone. He understood that, in the end, it was himself he needed to listen to. And though the evening wasn't over yet, George knew he had a choice. Maybe it wasn't about a great victory. It was about stopping the game played by others' rules. And that moment became the true beginning of his new path. When George got home, he blocked his phone and disconnected it from all those people who wanted to make him part of their games. He felt that now he was back in his place. And no matter how many calls would come next, the most important thing was that now he chose who to listen to and what to pay attention to. And this choice, this was his true victory.